Welcome back, everyone. I hope everybody's ready for some new encounters tonight, because boy, am I about to deliver. In the last 2 weeks, I've received some really amazing encounter stories. I cannot stress how much I appreciate all of you that have sent me your stories. Absolute legends, each and every one of you. And you listeners as well. All you guys keep this train rolling. Without you, the channel would not be here. All right. Is everybody ready to dive in? Let's go ahead and get into tonight's encounters. Grab a drink, lock your doors and windows, hit the lights, and let's get started. The Dogman of Big Thicket, Texas. You know, Reels, years ago when I was a bit younger, I would have never thought I'd be one of these people with a story like this to tell. Of course, I've heard many of these stories, but deep down, I'll be honest, I never really believed any of them. But a real man can admit when he's wrong, and I admit it. I was dead wrong. I spent my whole life enjoying everything involving the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, hunting, you name it. I love it all. I went camping in some of the most remote parts in the state of Texas. Again, I've heard plenty of stories about all these strange things and monsters in the woods. Ghost lights, Bigfoot, even legends that hint to creatures that can shapeshift. As I said before, I always wrote these off as a bunch of nonsense. That is, until 2018, when I ran into something in the Big Thicket National Preserve that I just don't know how to rationalize or explain it away. Let me tell you about it. I'll try to remember as much as I can about that day. It happened at the end of September, just as the brutal Texas summer was starting to cool down. I had taken a week off work and planned a solo hiking trip through part of the Big Thicket. If any of you listening is not familiar with it, the Big Thicket is one of the most densely forested areas in the state of Texas. It's a massive stretch of wilderness with swamps, pine forests, and winding trails that can take you miles away from civilization. It's truly a beautiful and amazing part of the country. Anyway, I'd been hiking for about 3 days, covering roughly around 10 miles a day, camping well off the trail where I could find a good spot. I was deep in the back country, far away from any roads or other people. The first couple nights were uneventful, just the usual sounds around a camp, nothing to cause any concern. Just occasionally throughout the night you'd hear a rustling of an armadillo or raccoon in the bushes, nothing to worry about. But it was on the 4th night of being out there. Something changed. I set up my camp in a clearing near a tiny creek. I whipped up a quick and easy meal as I was pretty tired. And I just settled down into my tent right after it got dark. I didn't notice that the woods were more quiet on this night than they had been the previous 3 nights. It was almost too quiet. Normally you hear frogs, bugs, something. But that night, everything just shut down. I remember laying in my tent staring at the nylon ceiling, feeling this very strange sense of unease and nervousness. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was just outside the tent staring straight at it. I can't be for sure, but it was probably a little past midnight when I finally heard movement right outside of the tent. I knew right away it wasn't just a regular animal noise. It was something large moving through the bushes around my campsite. I quickly set up and started rummaging through my pack looking for my flashlight. When I finally found it and pulled it out of the pack, my knife came out with it and fell onto the tent floor. The footsteps stopped instantly. I held my breath and stopped moving. I'm assuming whatever this was out there thought I was sleeping, but now it knew that I was awake, and it also knew that I was now aware of its presence as well. This was not an ideal situation to be in. Over and over, trying to calm myself, I kept saying, "It's a deer, it's a deer. Or maybe a hog, it's gotta be a hog, or a deer. Or maybe a hog, it's gotta be a deer or a hog." Whatever this was, it had a strong, predatory patience. It still wasn't moving or making a sound, but I knew it was out there because I didn't hear it leave. After a few minutes of this horrible silence, I finally worked up enough nerve to slowly unzip the tent. I shined the flashlight around all over the campsite, but I never saw anything, just the trees and the darkness of the woods. I'm confident that this was probably more unsettling to me at the time, than actually seeing something, because I knew that I heard it, and I knew that I also didn't hear it leave. What was it? Where did it go? Was I actually losing my mind? I started to feel like I had imagined the whole thing, and for the rest of the night, nothing else happened. I didn't get very much sleep after that. The next morning, I packed up camp and decided to press on, telling myself it was just a fluke and everything was fine. I just needed to get to a new area and get away from whatever was out there. I hiked another 10 miles that day, going deeper into the woods. I finally reached this narrow dirt trail that cut through a thick stretch of pines. It was late afternoon, maybe an hour or so before the sun was going to set, when I saw something ahead of me on the trail. Like many I've heard before, my first thought was, this is a black bear standing on its hind legs. It was extremely tall for an animal. It was black in color and very thick and broad. It was probably around 6.5 to 7 feet tall. But as I started slowly creeping closer, it didn't take me very long at all to figure out that I wasn't looking at a bear. As you probably guessed, it was something else entirely. It was the thing that so many people swear doesn't exist. It was a Dogman. If anyone wants to tell me they're not real, then explain to me why I was staring at one with my own eyes. I get it, though. I wouldn't have believed it either until I saw it myself. Just keep listening to these encounters. Keep digging. Maybe eventually you'll be graced by one's presence. For your sake, I really hope that doesn't happen. Anyway, the thing had the body structure and shape of a man. It looked to be extremely muscular from what I could tell, and had really long arms. The shape of the head was without a doubt, no question, canine in nature. Although its snout wasn't long like most of the stories I've heard, it was a lot shorter. But it obviously still had the pointed ears, and of course it had those piercing yellow eyes that were staring at me as soon as I spotted it. Although it was covered in black hair, the head shaped, the snout, everything about the head reminded me of a hyena. Its head was absolutely massive in size. It's no wonder I hear people shoot these things and they don't die. They're not bulletproof, I don't suspect, but the size of this thing, its skull would have to be 2 inches thick. I can't tell you in words how big its head was. A lot of people also explain their posture as being hunched forward. This one was hunched as well. Maybe it's due to the abnormally large head. I'm not sure, just taking a guess. It would take some serious muscle to hold up a head that big. After I stopped walking and I just stood there, it didn't make any aggressive sounds or it didn't move in my direction. Its body was facing off to the left and its head was slightly turned looking at me. It slowly turned its body to face me. This is when I started looking at more details. It had no tail. Its hands and its feet were both huge like its head. They were oversized, completely disproportionate to the rest of the body. That's a good way to put it. It did have the backwards bent legs like a dog would have if it was standing. It may have stood there like that, staring at me for a total of 5 seconds at the most. Then, in a quick, single, fluid motion, it dropped down to all fours and bolted like a bullet off the trail and into the trees. I could hear it breaking limbs and knocking down bushes as it went. The power that this thing displayed, the speed in which it could move. This is an absolute monster. If one of these things comes for you, you will not get away. There's no chance. I was scared, I won't lie, but I didn't freeze up as soon as I saw that thing take off. I then knew it was time for me to follow suit and head in the opposite direction. I was shaking, and I was overcome with a sense of dread. It was like I had witnessed something that no man is supposed to see. I didn't run, as that's a well-known no-no dealing with a predator, but I did speed walk as fast as I could without actually running. Every 100 yards or so I would stop and listen to make sure it wasn't following me. But I was convinced it was still nearby and it was watching me. It could have been, I don't know for sure, or it could have just been my paranoia from witnessing a monster in the woods. I hiked all the way through the night, barely stopping to rest. By the next morning, I had made it back to a more well-traveled section of the preserve. I never saw the creature again. But I never felt safe until I was back inside my truck driving away from that place. To this day, I can't really be certain that what I saw was a dogman. I'm definitely no expert in all this, but I've read a lot of stories and listened to every YouTube channel that's available about these creatures. I don't know what else it could have been. As far as I know, the description matches a dogman to the letter. It wasn't a bear. It definitely wasn't a human. Like I said, I can't tell you exactly what it was, but I can with full certainty tell you what it isn't. It isn't something that I ever want to see again. Everyone please be safe and careful out there in the woods. These things are real, and they are roaming the country. And from what I witnessed, if you come up on an aggressive one, you're probably not going to be home for dinner that night. Thanks for listening to my story. Everyone take care. Ronnie. Tonight's second encounter. My name is Jake M. I was born and raised in this part of Oklahoma just across the Kansas border, in a small town called Hardin. Hardin is the place where everybody knows everybody else. The only excitement you can find is on a Sunday night football game or an occasional wild animal sighting. I grew up with a lot of love for hunting and camping, but I also had a strong respect for the dangers of nature. It wasn't until I started working as a deputy sheriff in 2002 that I realized just how thin the line is between calm and chaos out there. When I became a deputy, I figured it would be pretty straightforward. Most of the calls were mundane, noise complaints, lost animals, and the occasional fight here and there in a bar. It was my dream job, but it was work that kept me busy. I didn't expect things to get strange. Certainly not in a place like Hardin. But then came the night I'm about to tell you about. The night that I just don't know how to explain away. The night that changed my entire life. This is the first time I've ever told the story publicly to anyone. Well, not in its entirety, anyway. Hell, I didn't even tell my wife about it until last year, and I even then left out all of the worst parts. For years, I tried to convince myself it was just a bad night, a slip-up, a moment of exhaustion maybe. But deep down in the depths of my soul, I've always known it was something far worse, and something that I cannot explain. Maybe you'll believe me, maybe you won't, but I'm telling you this now after all these years, because I feel like this will help me to just let it go and move on. At least I'm hoping that it will. I was 30 years old when it happened. I had just started my job as a deputy. The area I patrolled was mostly farmland and small homesteads scattered over miles of dirt roads, interrupted only by the occasional rundown gas station or convenience store. Most of the time it's pretty quiet, and that was fine by me. That meant less work and less stress. I got used to listening to the hum of the highway, the occasional call for a stray cow or someone's dog getting out. But sometimes the silence could get to you, too, especially when you're alone in the middle of nowhere at 2 or 3 a.m., and that's exactly what it was that night. The silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your ears. I remember that whole night as clear as day. It started with a routine call from a local farmer, Hank P. He had reported some strange behavior from his animals. He said his cows were spooked, his dogs were acting up, and he thought that he had spotted something out by his barn. He wasn't sure what it was at first. He assumed it was a deer, but then he said it was something bigger, something standing on 2 legs like a human. He said it was black, and it looked like a giant wolf. He was terrified. That wasn't normal for any of these folks to be frightened of any kind of wildlife. These were tough, hard-working people that didn't spook. I kept that in the back of my mind, but I figured it was just another call to chase away some wild animals or shoo off some coyotes. But when I pulled up to Hank's farm, I felt it too. That heavy air that I can't really explain. It was just a feeling like something was wrong, like something evil was around, if that makes any sense at all. If you've ever felt that feeling, then you'll understand what I mean. And if you haven't, you're probably thinking right about now that I'm a crazy person. Either way, I'm going to continue the story. I parked near the front gate and knocked on the door, figuring I could get him to explain whatever he'd seen. I expected to hear his dogs barking at me from behind the door, or maybe a shout telling me to stay back, but I didn't hear a thing. There wasn't a sound coming from inside the house. I knocked again and a little harder this time, but I still got no answer. His dogs were nowhere to be heard, not a peep from them. It was like the house was abandoned, even though the lights were on. I called out his name a few times, but again got no response. I was beginning to get highly concerned. I started walking around the property, shining my flashlight across the fields and the outbuildings. Everything was completely still and silent. I noticed the same signs of distress that Hank had mentioned. The cows were showing signs of unease and stress. Their heads were darting back and forth, staring off into the distance. The dogs' kennels were empty, and I couldn't find any sign of Hank's animals. The place just felt abandoned. I noticed something flickered out in the darkness of one of the fields. It took me a couple of seconds to realize that it was a set of glowing yellow eyes just above the ground, about 6 feet, up in the tree line. They were not the reflection of car headlights, or the flash of a distant light at all. The eyes were still, not moving, just watching me, and occasionally I would catch them blink. Like a normal, rational individual, I assumed it was just some small animal, or possibly maybe a bear. I slowly started to realize these eyes were too far off the ground, too high up to be any of the previously mentioned animals. They had stopped blinking, and they were not moving at all now. They were just focused on me. I knew in my mind that I should turn around and leave. But I didn't, because I knew I needed to stay and figure out where Hank was and if he was okay. Safety, of course, it was my job. Something inside me told me to walk towards those eyes. I don't know why, but I took a few slow steps in the direction of the trees, watching those eyes as they continued to watch me. I stopped about 50 feet from where I saw them. I was too far to make out any details, but they didn't blink or move. But I was positive they were looking straight at me, and that feeling of being watched, it hit me hard, and I froze. I started shouting over and over, very loud, trying to break the tension that I had in my chest. It was the only thing I could think to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to appear brave or if I thought shouting would scare whatever it was off, but it didn't do either of those things. The eyes shifted. They moved slightly to the left, then to the right. It was as though whatever it was getting a better look at me, deciding what to do. And that's when I noticed something that I'll never be able to forget. It was the way those eyes seemed to shift, like they were calculating something, like it was deciding whether I was a threat or not. At this point, all I wanted was to get back to my patrol car. But instead, I foolishly did the exact opposite. I walked closer to whatever it was out there. That's when I saw it move. The creature dropped down low, almost impossibly low, and began to crawl toward me. It didn't stand up, it didn't charge quickly, it just started moving on all fours, slowly and methodically, its head low to the ground. It was like an animal stalking its prey. I couldn't even breathe. It wasn't a bear. This wasn't like any animal I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like that. It was moving too fast for something of its size. Its movements were so odd. It looked like the ground beneath it was bending as it crawled. And every time I tried to move, my legs, they just felt heavier, like the air was holding me down. I was completely paralyzed. It was at that moment that I began to hear this thing growl. The growling stopped pretty quickly, and then I heard a grunt, not from the creature, but from somewhere behind me. I spun around, and that's when I realized I was no longer alone. I wasn't sure how, but there was something moving behind me in the dark. Not human, but something else, and it was way too close for comfort. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream, and this creature was getting even closer. I could almost feel the heat from its body, almost like it was breathing on me. Its presence was an oppressive weight on my chest. Suddenly, everything just went black. When I finally came to, I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I wasn't even on the farm. The last thing I remembered was staring at that set of yellow eyes and hearing that grunt and the growl. Now I was standing in a clearing. I was still on the edge of the property, but
The area looked very unfamiliar to me. Everything around me was still quiet. I checked my watch and it was dead. The digital readout blinked back at me, but it didn't change. It wouldn't work no matter how many times I pressed the button. I glanced around, and my radio was completely silent. I tried calling dispatch, but there was no response. Nothing but static. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the sun had not came up yet, and I checked my watch again, and 2 hours had disappeared just like that. A wave of sickness hit me. I started walking back towards my patrol car, but as I made my way across the clearing, I realized something was terribly wrong. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but I had this feeling like I had been somewhere. I don't know how to describe it. It's like I wasn't supposed to be there. I moved my hand down and realized my gun was gone as well. The holster was empty. My heart started to race. I had it on me when I approached the trees. I checked. I had it when I first stopped, when I first stepped onto Hank's property. But now it was gone. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How had I got to this area? How had 2 hours just vanished? What in the hell happened? I started walking back towards the barn, trying to make sense of everything. The whole area was creepy and silent still. The same unnatural stillness that had gripped me when I first got there. My feet felt heavy, as if I was walking through mud, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I didn't know what I was doing, I just knew I had to get out of there. It wasn't until I finally reached my car that I realized something even worse. My dash cam was gone as well. I opened the cruiser door, reached for the radio, and tried to turn it on, but there was no power. I could not get a signal. When I finally managed to get back into town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I got into the patrol car, but it was like I wasn't fully there. My body moved, my hands gripped the wheel, but my mind felt like it was lagging behind, like I was watching myself from a distance. I pulled into the lot behind the station and just sat there for a few minutes trying to gather myself. My hands were shaking. I hadn't noticed until I reached for the door handle. It wasn't just from fear. It was something deeper, something I can't put into words here. Finally, I stepped out of the car and walked inside. The station was quiet, just a couple of night shift guys at their desks. I must have looked like hell because as soon as I walked in, Deputy Frank, an old-timer who had been with the department for decades, looked up from his coffee and frowned. He asked me if I was all right. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. I felt like I was about to be sick. I finally got out the words that I needed to see the sheriff. Frank gave me a long, searching look, but he nodded and told me that he was in his office to go ahead and go on in. I didn't even knock, I just walked in and closed the door. The sheriff was sitting behind the desk flipping through paperwork. He barely even looked up. He told me it better be important. He was still focused on the papers in front of him. I told him that I thought I had lost time. That got his attention. He put the papers down and finally looked at me. His eyes kind of narrowed and he asked me what the hell I was talking about. I told him I didn't know what had happened. It was out at Hank P's place. He called in about something spooking his animals. I got there, saw something with yellow eyes, then I woke up somewhere else. My gun's gone, my dash cam is gone, and I lost 2 hours. He stared at me for a long minute. Then he leaned back in his chair and his expression was unreadable. But I saw something in his eyes at that moment, something that unsettled me even more. He wasn't surprised at all about what I was saying. He asked me, "You don't remember anything?" Not after I saw the creature. One minute I was staring at the eyes, and the next thing I know, I was standing in a clearing. My watch was dead. My radio wasn't working, and I didn't know what had happened. I was very confused. He exhaled through his nose, rubbed his jaw, and asked me if I was sure about the time loss. I told him I'd checked my watch before I saw that thing, and it was just past 2 a.m. And when I came to, it was after 4. For a minute, the sheriff just sat there staring at his desk. Then he reached into one of his drawers and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a drink, took a long swig, and then, without a word, poured another glass and slid it across the desk to me. I would have never usually drank on duty, but this time I took it. He said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." He was staring straight into my eyes. He told me I was going to write up a report saying that I found nothing unusual at Hank's place, and the animals were just spooked, maybe by a coyote or a bobcat. He said, "That's all. You're not going to mention lost time. You're not going to mention glowing yellow eyes. You're not going to say a damn thing about missing equipment. Do you understand?" I just stared at him in disbelief. And before I could even say what, his face was hard, and he said, "You heard what I said." I told him I lost 2 hours, my gun was gone, something happened out there, and he cut me off and said, "You don't want to go digging into it." His voice was firm, and he said, "Trust me on this. Don't dig into it." My stomach twisted, and I'm in a knot, and I knew that he knew what was going on, or at least he knew something about it. He didn't say anything else for a long time. He downed the rest of his whiskey and set the glass down with enough force that I could tell he was getting irritated. I'll never forget what he said next, because it completely blew me away. He said, "Jake, there are things out there, things that you don't want to mess with, things that you don't want to know about." He leaned forward and told me that the people who go digging, who go looking, they don't always come back. I felt like someone poured a pitcher of ice water over my entire body. I asked him what I was supposed to do. He said, "You're going to forget about it," like it was the simplest thing in the world. I clenched my fist and told him that I couldn't just forget about it. This is when his expression went dark. He said, "You will, because if you don't, you're going to find out real fast that there are folks who will make you forget one way or another." Of course, my first question was, who are these people? He didn't answer, he just gave me a look that made it clear that I didn't want to know these people. I finally just stood up, my legs still unsteady. I felt sick, confused, and now I was highly pissed off. But I also felt fear. He finally told me to go home and get some sleep, and do not return to that farm. I didn't argue with him. I decided to just go. That was 20 years ago. I stayed on the force for another 6 years before finally quitting and moving out of the state. I've tried to let it go. I've tried to convince myself it was just stress, exhaustion, or maybe just a bad dream. But I know deep down it was real. I can't keep lying to myself. I need to know what happened. If anyone listening to this has any idea of what happened here, please leave a comment. I'm going to be reading through the comments looking for anything. If you don't want to do that and you want to be more secretive, send Reels an email and maybe we can get in touch that way. I just need to know what happened. Was this a dogman? Was this something else? Can a dogman make you lose time? I only ask because the yellow eyes seems to be a thing with the dogman encounters, along with the description that Hank gave me. I know I never laid eyes on that thing, but I have no idea what it was. If anyone knows anything or anyone has had a similar thing happen to them, I would love to hear about it. Thank you, Reels, and thanks in advance for anyone that shares any information. I'll be in touch. Jake. Well, what do you guys think? The first story was without a doubt a Dogman. No question. But the second story from the deputy, I'm not sure what to even think about that one. I've never heard of a Dogman behaving this way or causing anyone to lose time. The guy seems desperate for information, and I would really like to help him if I can. A Dogman is really the only cryptid I have any knowledge of to speak. Does anyone know what this could have been or what could have happened to this guy? Like he said, leave a comment, or if you want to be more discreet, shoot me an email and we'll try to figure this out. I want to thank both of these fellas for sending these stories. As always, I really enjoyed narrating them, and I hope I did a good job. I want to thank all of you legends for tuning in to listen tonight. I really appreciate it. I have another encounter that I want to upload separately. It'll either be posted later tonight or early in the morning. I'm curious to get your guys' take on that one as well. It's a doozy. Well, that's going to do it for this upload. I hope you guys enjoyed these encounters, and I also hope if you're not subscribed to the channel, that you'll consider doing so. Please like and share the video as it helps the channel to grow. When the channel grows, the information can reach more people, and hopefully, could possibly save someone's life. That is the goal here after all, to inform people of what's out there, and how dangerous it can really be in the woods. Until next time, my friends, watch over your loved ones, keep your head on a swivel, and as always, good night.